The early 2000s is a really nostalgic era for video games. We've got the Xbox, the PlayStation 2, and of course the GameCube. One of these things is not like the others. While the Xbox and PlayStation 2 could perfectly capture the more mature audiences with games like Halo and GTA San Andreas, Nintendo was still pretty stuck with this reputation that they were solely a kids' company. And hey, what were the 2000s even about, if not being avidly insecure over people thinking you're cool and like guns in your games? Fast forward 20 or so years, and you'll find that most people look back on the GameCube pretty fondly. Its design helps it stand out against the other consoles of the time. It has games that are still pretty relevant to this day, and a lot of people regard its controller as one of the best to ever be designed. I am one of those people. God damn, this thing feels so good. So, what changed? This sort of attitude towards the console was obviously not present at the time, because it really didn't sell that well. And the same people who talk about how much it failed are also the same people explaining how great and underrated it really was. Well, today, I want to give a slightly different perspective, and rather than focus solely on why the GameCube failed, I want to ask the question, did the GameCube really fail? The GameCube initially released on the 14th of September 2001, and it seemed like Nintendo had high hopes for the console, estimating that by 2005 it would have sold 50 million units, but ended up only selling 22 million over its entire lifespan. There was some pretty tough competition during the 6th generation of consoles, and it didn't manage to beat out Microsoft or Sony. But this is the first problem. Why were Nintendo trying so hard to compete with them? People who worked close with the GameCube have noted that the system didn't really have too much to set it apart from the PS2 or Xbox, and so ended up being in more of a competition than it should have been with them. And you really didn't want to be in a competition with the PS2 at the time. Jesus Christ. The unique selling point of the GameCube was meant to be its portability, but the focus really just wasn't there. Again, this is something that former employees have looked back on and regret. The concept was there, and the handle would have made moving the system so much easier, but Nintendo just couldn't figure out how to market that into selling the console. So in the end, it became another quirky feature of the GameCube, which was nice to have, but didn't really help it commercially. A lot of reviews for the console at the time were in agreement that while the price of the console was a big bonus, and the quality of the games were great, they really hated the general design. Looking at the other consoles at the time, they all had this very sleek and sophisticated design, which really screams 2000s obsession with supposedly futuristic technology. And then, looking at the GameCube, it was anything but this. The majority of complaints about how the system looked came down to it having this childish appearance, which was almost toy-like. The choice to make it purple and a big chunky plastic box admittedly does give this sort of impression. Though, weirdly, this is what I, and many other people nowadays, love about its design. It's just so iconic and unique. The handle probably also didn't help with this, since it seemingly wasn't made clear that this was supposed to be a console that you could take to different places with ease. Another complaint that a lot of reviews had was the lack of online play in its games, and the general lack of launch games, which really didn't help give people a reason to get this thing for a while. Developers were also seeming to prefer creating games for the PS2 and Xbox, and either scaling down the support for the GameCube, or in some cases, entirely stopping it. This was mainly due to being far more profitable for them to just create games for these other systems, as the GameCube wasn't really netting them too much money in comparison. So, we've got difficult competition, not the best marketing, an unfortunate reputation that is only magnified by the fact that this thing looks like a kid's lunchbox in an era of futuristic designs, and developers preferring other systems. It's really not difficult to see why this thing failed commercially. It's worth noting that Nintendo themselves obviously learned from these mistakes, because the Wii did everything right, from its great marketing, to its design, to it appealing to everybody except for their competitors' demographic. But what do we actually class as a failure? Is a commercial failure the be-all and end-all of what defines if a system has done its job? It goes without saying that a lot of the games on the GameCube were absolutely fantastic. I mean, we've got Melee, Wind Waker, Sunshine, Shrek Extra Large, never mind, I'd rather quit while I'm ahead here. The main point of a gaming system is obviously to play games, and the GameCube really did have a lot of great titles to play. Even if we were to define failure as not making enough money, some of the games that were created for the GameCube have ended up being a sort of investment for Nintendo. Super Mario Sunshine is one of the beloved 3D Mario games, and was bundled into the 3D All-Stars game, and while it had the help of Galaxy and 64, this let Nintendo print off a bit of free money. Wind Waker first released on the GameCube, but ended up getting a remastered version on the Wii U as well, which not only made a bit of money off of an older game, but also helped boost the Wii U sales a little at the same time. God knows it needed it. On top of this, some of the new series and IPs that were created for the console have grown to become absolute powerhouses for Nintendo. Metroid Prime 1 and 2 released on the GameCube, which led to a third game on the Wii, a fourth game in the works, and a remastered game for the Switch. Pikmin also made its debut on the console, which has had 2 console sequels, a handheld game, and similarly to Metroid, has a fourth game in the works. But one that really stands out to me is Animal Crossing. The Animal Crossing series is among Nintendo's most profitable IPs. The first game didn't do too bad on the GameCube, but the series really hit its stride in Animal Crossing Wild World for the Nintendo DS. There were then a handful of other games, notably newly for the DS, until we got to Animal Crossing New Horizons, which has proven itself to be a massive success, with a dedicated fanbase who would absolutely buy a new Animal Crossing game at the drop of a fucking hat. No questions asked. There are quite a few more examples like this, and realistically speaking, the GameCube almost looks like a long-term investment for Nintendo, while also appeasing their fans with some genuinely great games. While the console at the time didn't make all of Nintendo's dreams come true, without it, we possibly wouldn't have had quite a lot of the games and series that we currently have, especially considering these games were designed the way they were because they were made for the GameCube. With the Wii's obsession with motion controls and a completely different controller setup, who knows if we would have gotten some of these games, or what they would have looked like if designed for a different console. Out of all of the Nintendo consoles, I feel like we are currently in an era where people are most nostalgic for the Wii and the GameCube, since those people are now of the age where these things were a big part of their childhood, and now we're all grown up. The GameCube has started having this resurgence in people caring about it more in recent years, which means that whenever Nintendo decide to remaster one of their older games, they tend to sell really well. It's the same reason I immediately pre-ordered my copy of 3D All-Stars. Galaxy was my all-time favourite Wii game. Sunshine and 64 were just great extras to have for me. The early 2000s generally do have this element of nostalgia to them at the moment, simpler times and all that I guess, and while it doesn't really help the GameCube sell more units, it definitely gives Nintendo a big incentive to remaster some of their older games, like we've seen them do before. If they ported something like Super Smash Bros. Melee to a modern console, it would easily be a hit. A lot of the GameCube games have tended to age pretty decently in my opinion. Melee, Sunshine, Wind Waker, Metroid Prime, Luigi's Mansion, Double Dash, all of these games still hold up fantastically to this day. And while some of them have already had the remastered treatment, Nintendo could easily make a quick profit with the others in one way or another. One thing that the GameCube brought to us, that has since been remade multiple times, is the controller. There was just something about this controller that felt great to use, especially for one of Nintendo's most popular series, Super Smash Bros. And so for the past couple of games, Nintendo have been able to produce a whole new bunch of these controllers with a little Smash logo on them, once again being able to make money from an old idea. It's me, I gave them money for an old idea. Commercially, the GameCube was a failure. That much is true. There seemed to be a lot of factors that just made it pretty tough for it to succeed among the other 6th-gen consoles at the time. The PlayStation 2 was an absolute powerhouse. Microsoft made a pretty decent debut on the console market. The Dreamcast wasn't really a big problem because it was in its final year by that point, but probably had a small impact on the GameCube nonetheless. It didn't seem that a console like the GameCube really had as much of a place in the console landscape at that time. Its general design didn't really seem to hit the mark. There were elements that could have been marketed a little bit better. Times were changing and the GameCube wasn't keeping up. And to make matters worse, developers had started to focus much more on games for the better performing platforms. But do I think the GameCube really failed? Not really, no. Well, at least not as much as it's made out to have. Looking at the wider picture, the GameCube succeeded at a lot of things. It had some stellar games, it was the console that took Nintendo from cartridges to discs, and its controller is maybe one of the best Nintendo have ever created. From a gamer's standpoint, the GameCube did its job successfully. But even if you only regard success in how much money did this thing make for Nintendo, there is absolutely a case to be made that the GameCube ended up being a long-term investment. So many amazing new IPs and series were born on the GameCube, and there is no telling if they would have even been the same on a different console. These games have then ended up making a ridiculous amount of money in sequels, remasters, and spin-offs. Not to mention that the controller seems to constantly be in relatively high demand, and will probably end up going back into production again at one point or another. The GameCube era was a really iconic one for Nintendo in my eyes. I was a bit too young during its lifespan to know much about video games, but eventually found one online years later. It's a cool piece of gaming history, but aside from that, it's a console that I have a real soft spot for, and one that I feel gets just a little bit too much flack. It was definitely underrated, but not a complete failure.